Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Good afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Good, good.
Good. I'm a little tired from baby chasing.
Yes.
Yeah. He's funny at night. He sleeps pretty consistently.
Oh, great.
I mean, you know, every 3 hours he needs to nurse, but
Mhm.
in between he sleeps, but he makes constant noises while he's asleep and loud
Interesting.
ones.
Interesting.
So I keep thinking and he needs something.
Like verbalizations? Okay,
Yeah,
not gutty works stuff.
yeah. No, mostly grunts and like bird sounds,
Oh,
like
okay.
seagull screams, and
There we go. Ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny.
I thought of that. Yeah,
Yeah, so he's at the caveman grunting and imitating animals.
a reptile he is.
Maybe still reptile, yeah.
Yeah,
That would be hissing more, you'd think, but
maybe. Yeah.
yeah, Tim Leary did a whole thing on that, in a book he called Exopsychology, where he talks about the different circuits and that people go through in development, like his model of the stages of development, and it's actually was part of his, serious psychological work, so to speak, but
Well, that might connect to what I wanted to talk a little more about today, just because it's been on my mind. I think I mentioned to you that as I've been trying to figure out how to get the gym experience to make sense, and this is relevant to the martial arts experience that I've had too.
mhm.
The the idea of bringing consciousness into whatever work is getting done in the physical body and how tricky that is has been on my mind. So it's like I can bring awareness to my physical body, but it's like meditation. Like by the end of a motion, my awareness might not be there anymore, and I have to keep bringing it back and bringing it back. And given the experience you've had with martial arts and meditation, I was wondering if this mind body connection might be interesting to talk about.
Sure. I think that's one of the interesting things about certain what we might categorize as adrenaline sports, where an adrenaline sport, is like, I'm rock climbing without ropes and free climbing, and I know that if I'm not here every nanosecond and being here with complete attention, that my life is forfeit. And people every year lose that challenge. I think the same thing happens maybe with riding a motorcycle really, really fast, or if you're into pistol dueling, some of these old, or fighting with foils in the old days, um, where you've literally got skin in the game. And there's also something about uh, fear of pain and actual pain kind of speak all the way down to the reptile brain. So they really get your attention on a lot of different levels. And I think with fighting, that's one of the things that I felt. It's like if you play poker, uh, if you're just playing for chips, nobody finds that very compelling because they have no attachment to the chips. It gets very compelling when they start playing with their own money or with their grandfather's pocket watch or, you know, there's famous stories, right?
The family home,
The
yeah.
family home, yeah, a lot of these the entire town of South Park, "Let it ride." Right, and, but that's, one of the things that makes it compelling, and I think that's the same thing with fighting is and I don't mean, formalized, I mean, actually, like, we're not that you're trying to hurt the person you're sparring with, but once you got to a certain level, at least in our school, you're not doing no contact. You're definitely hitting, and you're definitely the higher level you are, the harder you're hitting, and usually without equipment. And at the higher level you are, the better you are at not getting hit, and also at receiving it when you do get hit. And so you'd think that people would get hurt, but they typically don't. Minimal stuff. Um, But so that definitely brings your attention to it. In fact, I've said before that with beginners, sometimes what I would do is no big technique. I would just watch them, watch their attention through their eyes. And when they went away, I'd hit them like that simple. But so there is something about that that compels our immersion. I think there's maybe a similar thing that goes on with craftsmanship where you can get into a particular groove and you're not it's maybe the opposite of multitasking, intentional monotasking. You have to make that a thing.
I mean, there's all this evidence now that multitasking is just a waste of energy anyway. But it sounds like you're describing basically kind of the getting in the zone, right? What people talk about with concentration,
Mhm.
um, and concentration on an external thing is, I mean, maybe it's the same, but I have plenty of experience with that, playing music and
Sure, music is very much about that.
various things.
Yeah.
Um, and but the internal, like, okay, I want to feel this exercise in this muscle. I want to maintain tension in this muscle as I'm moving it.
Right.
Like to have that internal seems to be a little different somehow. And
Uh-huh.
and
Well, it's a specific quality of
and
awareness.
meditation, I think maybe similarly.
Yeah. Well,
I
it's
think
called proprioception.
yeah, David Bohm talks about proprioception. Say
Yeah.
more.
Well, it's basically knowing where your foot is without having to look down. And I think that because I've been musing about this. Uh, we big long philosophical discussion that's not solved yet is we have the realm of meaning and we have the realm of matter, as we've spoken about. And somehow these are connected, but not in any obvious way. And uh, our intentionality seems to be involved. But what is it that takes the thought or the meaning that I should wiggle my fingers like this that translates it to the actual figures wiggling? And within the internal martial arts, and I think the external martial arts share it, going all the way back to the Yellow Emperor's classic on internal medicine, the root foundational text of Chinese medicine, is this idea of qi, which is an idea of like people have tried to describe this, and it's been mentioned in different traditions. In yoga, they call it prana. Uh, some French person called it elan vital. Uh, I'll have to dig out who pulled that out. Uh, Wilhelm Reich referred to organ. But so there's this idea of an energy that can influence matter somehow, and yet it has an intelligence. And some people, I don't. I'll have to search this also. The idea of biosentience, an energy that is linked with biology. When I direct chi inside my body using traditional methods, the thing that we notice in the body is its circulation opens up. So somehow my intent connected to that intention, that physical function, just like intent when I swing my arm out. I said something went on internally to will me to swing the arm out. So what is this connective thing between these worlds? And, this idea of chi becomes like, when it's connected to the big Taoist concepts of qi, like which we've talked about, the Hunyuan qi, the thing that connects all of nature to the clockwork of nature to keep all the gears fitting and turning in sync. Um, there is a type of biointelligence there, and I think that that's involved with in the internal arts. We talk about yi, which is intentionality, and we talk about chi, which is the energy moving. And that becomes the connection. In the classical associations, they say that spirit, purely in the realm of mind, is the general, and the troops, muscle, purely in the realm of matter, are the troops, and the chi is the flag that was used to signal charge or retreat, rotate left, rotate right, what the cavalry would use a bugle for. The old Chinese armies would use flags, banners. They referred to them as, right? So the idea that something crosses this barrier that seems inexplicable, that where consciousness manages to influence matter. And so that's where this idea of chi comes in there, and whether there is a thing chi or whether the chi is there as a metaphorical, like imaginary numbers in mathematics. It helps us explain things, but we don't necessarily poke it with a stick, or it seems to exist in this realm that makes it makes it resistant to a material confirmation. And yet, in one experiences, like some of the other non-ordinary experiences, if you do certain practices, you can do certain things that would induce one to believe that there is some usefulness to this model, at least. Let's say that.
Yeah, like you've mentioned, practicing generating chi, enabling people to be out in the cold and perfectly comfortable, shirtless, and
Yeah,
generating
yeah,
heat and steaming up a towel or
yeah,
a
right.
blanket
Now,
that's
getting to
on
the
them. Yeah.
point where you can be comfortable in the heat, or comfortable rather in the cold by generating heat, that's not a super advanced thing.
I've had that experience
Yeah.
circle walking
Yeah, yeah, circle walking
and
will
not
do
like
it.
running around a circle. It wasn't a cardio thing.
Right, right. Circle walking
Yeah.
can do it. I've done it in Anchorage, Alaska, it down to a T-shirt, and, and you know that there's something unusual going on because when you stop, you immediately get cold like you would normally. And, so clearly something was going on, and I've experienced the same thing in the brief time that I did Kundalini yoga. So, this was not any major achievement. This just meant you're basically doing the practice right. Uh, and then this is also one of the things that people tend to use as a confirmation. Like, Bruce Francis would talk about Wang Suchin, and he'd be out in the parks, and they said this guy generated so much heat you could warm your hands on him like standing next to a wood stove. And so there is a confirmation that the Tibetans. Another great book about not ordinary things is Alexandra David Neal, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, and she talks about the art of tumo, which is the Tibetan art of generating heat. There's a story of Milarepa, the famous poet, saint, sage of Tibet, getting caught in a snowstorm and just going into a snow cave and doing tumo for the months it took for winter to pass until he could go out again. So that is an advanced level. But just being in the cold, doing a practice and heating yourself up, that's not an advanced practice. That's something you can do, you know.
So I'm curious, kind of taking the framework of intent and then the soldiers and the chi connecting them, using that framework to kind of inform what I was asking about this physical meditation or physical self-awareness. and not just proprioception, like not just knowing where the muscle is, but keeping awareness in the muscle, keeping awareness in the movement. Like I've had this experience with cloudy hands, of like doing it at first required thinking about everything being in the right place at the right time, the arms and legs moving together, that kind of stuff.
Right.
But once the movement became readily available, there was still this great merit in keeping attention in it, not thinking. Um,
Yeah, I mean that there's different I think we there are some shades of distinction in there. A state of awareness in the body is a feeling. And so when I'm doing certain practices, there are certain feelings that I'm trying to generate. And all I'm doing is staying with the feeling. And as opposed to having a mental picture and sending my attention into that mental picture. And that's why my attention is kind of free. You might say my attention is embodied in my pores. And that's where this idea of the chi becomes a sort of a biointelligence that you can kind of listen with, and you can like it has an it'll tell you things. But that has to do with this with paying attention to it, right, and developing it to that. So it's different than paying attention to something in my semantic world. I definitely have thoughts that tell me to engage that, but the proprioceptive phenomenon, right? I think it's the same term. I'm just being aware of things that if you don't do these practices, you won't feel them, so they won't ever show up on your proprioceptive map or model, if you will. But it's different than being aware of, that's why once my body, when we say, for example, Chuangzi says, when the shoe fits, the foot is forgotten. When my awareness infuses my body correctly, I don't have to be aware of it in the way that I'm aware of objective things. And that's why my consciousness is free to go to the opponent and say, "What?" And know that my response, or however, I've just got these autopilots synced in. So I'm going to control distance. I'm going to control timing. I'm going to feel out the waves of the opponent's body getting ready to launch power and the in between valleys. And like, it's just like dancing to the music. You just listen to the music and don't let something go, hey, and take your attention away. And in that sense, it's very similar to ceremonies. And I think it actually, in some sense, it's the same psychological component, which has to do with being able to put your awareness into a certain state that's not just thinking of an idea of a certain state, but is actually being in a certain state. Like dancing is a certain state. I'm hearing the music, I'm moving my body with it. I'm not thinking, now's a beat, I'll move my shoulder forward. Now's another beat, I'll pull it back. I'm not, maybe if I'm really at the beginning of learning, but the idea is to get to that shoe fits, foot is forgotten condition, to where now I'm just embodying that, and I just have this idea of movement, and boom, I move, right? And same with music. It was scales and I was conscious about it, but now I'm thinking about feeling where the music is or what I'm wanting to, now I'm coming to this calm part, or now I'm going to have a more exciting part, or there's more tension, but the mechanism is it's embodied. It's not that it's not in awareness, it's just not the focus of awareness. It's
mhm.
like I'm
Yeah,
aware through it, maybe is the way to say that.
yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious. I think a lot of people have a hard time with meditation. Is it because you think there's not a- an apparent activity that the attention can be channeled into? Rather, the activity is limited sort of to observation? And like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on there. Some of the early meditation practices they give to people are like breath counting. The problem in bed of the extra arm? People have actually invented a bed that has a hole so your arm can go underneath because there's a problem and where anyway, it's like that conscious mind is like an extra arm, right? Doesn't have anywhere to go to be comfortable.
Oh, like if you lay on your side.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And there's like there's just that well, the conscious mind kind of becomes like that. And I think that's a version we might have spoken about this idea before that comes from Buddhism. That is there's a monkey component to the mind and an elephant component to the mind. And I think, I don't really work I mean, I did the Zen center thing for years and but I don't really operate that way as much anymore. So, for example, when I first started doing internal practices, I would do certain practices to intentionally move chi, and they had certain components to it, and I'd try to make sure that all those components were there, and I'd practice, and I'd get associated with it, like you might with playing a violin or something, where it's like, okay, you've got your tuning and your thing, and you're rosining your bow in the hole, and there's a procedure that you go through, and you warm up and then you can fiddle away, right? But then you see somebody who's like at a very, very high level, and there's an immediacy to it where it's just boom and they're there, right? And in the same sort of a way, now with certain facility, I just do the thing that directs chi to the hands, as opposed to maybe going through all those sorts of steps and things. And there's a Zen saying that Bruce Lee ripped off to apply to martial arts. And the Zen saying goes, before I began to practice the Tao, the mountains and rivers were just mountains and just rivers. And then after I began to study the way, mountains were no longer mountains and rivers were no longer rivers. But then when I attained the way, mountains were again mountains and rivers were again rivers. So Bruce Lee steals that and puts kicks and punches in there. And that's exactly the same kind of process. When I knew nothing about martial arts, I'd see somebody throw a punch and go, oh, there's a punch. The punch is just a punch. The kick is just a kick. But then I start to study and say, well, actually, that punch maybe a little too much shoulder. Maybe the punch is, and now a punch is not just a punch. It's got all these different details. And I start to qualify it. I want to guide it. I want to move it into certain things. There's a sweet spot. There's things that I consider better. There's things that I consider worse, and I try to put myself into that groove. And then finally, after doing that for a long time, I attain a state of naturalness, and then I just whip the punch out. And we get to that stage where we say we defeat the opponents like snapping our fingers, like going for a walk. It's just very natural, just. But the idea is like this is like Picasso when he's painting Don Quixote, and it's like he didn't start there. He started painting every detail, and then attained that freedom through this process. And this is a similar kind of thing to that. So with meditation, I think it's the same thing. For me, there were states where I was lucky enough, and again, I think this is where being in a natural environment really is to your advantage. There were states where I was lucky enough to have a natural state of meditation arise, and I was able to go, "Oh, that." And so now instead of having to go through all those different processes and machinations to try to get to this place, you realize that something about that place is something that's allowed to happen rather than forced to happen. And that all those things that you were doing were just kind of clever ways to try to get to where that thing would arise. And so once you get familiarity with it, you just go straight to it. Like the Buddha said, once you catch the fish, you don't need the net anymore. And so once you've gotten there and you kind of get your handle on it, now you can kind of move towards that. And I think that for a lot of people, for a lot of stages, the big revelation is not in the meditation. It's in the unceasingness and the ubiquity of the non-meditative state. The idea that to do basically nothing should be should require no effort, technically. Right? I mean, we're talking about not doing anything. Look at how easy it is for your dog. Right? And, a few belly rubs and he's in the groove, you know? And, but that's where I have found that maybe certain moments, particularly that were really, really charged of being, I pretty much in a state of solitude in a natural environment. I mean, I went to these natural environments typically with friends, but I don't think that the moments that were the most charged were were shared moments. I think they were more, solo moments. And and I do think that there's an energetic function to the natural environment that will help to inspire meditation. But that being said, this is like the process that Lao Tzu refers to as if you take muddy water and you just let it sit, eventually the water will become clear. But that doesn't say that that's just going to be, when we translate the metaphor to the human mind, that doesn't mean that there won't be some squirming. And uh that's where I've also connected it to I think I had a conversation with Isaac about this, about how when you live out in the desert, you don't have every different thing that you're used to having 2 minutes away. And so if you're into smoking cigarettes and you're out of cigarettes, then the nearest cigarettes are some miles away. Now you've got another chore before you get to fulfillment. And so it works as a sort of a amplifier to show what our attachments are, to show the things that our mind leaps to keep our wheels spinning. And we know that the mind is kind of like a shark, right? It's always kind of looking for the next thing, and it's got to keep moving, right? Because if it stops moving like a shark, right, then it's nothing. It won't be oxygenated, right? And so I think that there are maybe times in nature, states in nature where we can be there where these natural states will come to arise. And and maybe rather than just look at moving from a normal state to a meditative state and back to a normal state and kind of breaking those out by time slots or the doors closed, and the idea of maybe moving our normal state closer and closer to a meditative state so that we don't have quite as far to traverse to visit that place. That's been more my approach. And we also then look at the things that are inclined to disturb our peace and push us farther from that place. So, I mean, that's one of the virtues of the meditative space, is that it contrasts with all the other things that fill our consciousness, which is, the I don't know. There's a lot to be said about that tendency and the nature for mind to mind.
That's bringing up for me. I think we've talked about this a few times, but this is an interesting way into it. So I think for some of the folks that listen to our podcast, they're um, business oriented. They're participating in organizations or leading organizations, and they're kind of using the material we generate to help them reframe how they think about the kinds of problems and solutions that organizations have. And this physicality is often divorced from how we think about our lives in organizations. I think we think about our rational and intellectual body basically driving the system in an organization. And I've thought a lot about what the impact has been of removing physicality from the idea of organizations. And this might be a good time to talk about that a little bit.
I mean, via technology.
Well, I mean, technology has certainly contributed. But before Zoom, let's say the normal thing to do was to sit around a conference room table and
Ah,
talk,
right.
opposed to, at some of the companies that I've been in, and we made a point of going for walks, to talk about certain types of things, especially complex things that needed to be blown up somehow.
Uh,
We would do that in the Sangre de Cristos, not in the office, um, when we could.
right.
So, but it's yeah, and I had colleagues who would set timers and do some exercise every X
Mhm,
amount of time and just
mhm.
keep connected to their body, or walk on a treadmill all day
Right.
at a standing desk, or whatever.
Sure.
So yeah,
Yeah.
curious how to bring these together.
Yeah, I mean, for me to be set free from the tyranny of the clock was a high priority. So in my personal setting, rather than gravitate towards a 9 to 5 at a certain location, I tended to I went to producing value, so one of my first jobs was as a goldsmith. So the thing I liked about that is the work was objective. Here it is. It's in your hand. You can look at it. It is what it is. Now, the conditions that I was in, that is what time of the day I produced it, or how many hours I worked that day, or what kind of music I listened to while I made it, or whether I worked for 45 minutes and took 2 hours off, or worked for 2 hours and took 45 minutes off, or didn't work for a whole day, or as long as I kept my agreements to deliver the value at the right time and place, all the other details were liberated. Now, some people can operate well in a setting like that, and some people, it's the kiss of death. And, I think that's where there might not be an ideal way, but there is what is suited to each person and where they are in their development and what the unique nature of their intelligence is. Um, you don't want the same type of creativity in your bookkeeper as you want in your marketing people, perhaps. Right? If you enjoy your freedom. Um, we're looking for certain focuses out of other people and out of ourselves. As an artist, I learned that I can't always produce everything at any time. Some things have to go through a process. And so if I'm living off of the product of that process, I have to negotiate and arrange my relationships with the other people that's such that I have the freedom to set it up the way I want to set it up. But we don't start that way. I didn't start that way. I started out as an apprentice and I had to be in the shop at 9 o'clock. And but then I finally ended up places where, in the same field where I was doing most of my paid work between midnight and 4 a.m.
One thing you're touching on here is, I don't know what other people call it, but a while ago I started differentiating between work-life balance and work-life integration, where when we think about work-life balance, we kind of like are trying to have work on one side of the scale and life on the other, and have those things balance, as opposed to intermingling them in a way that works. And so when you want to take a nap, and when you want to take a walk, and when you have the focus, use it,
Right,
and
right.
work and
Yeah,
generate
yeah.
value, right? um, and so there are times when it's necessary or valuable to work more than 8 hours a day or whatever. And there are times when it's okay to work less, and there's an ebb and flow to that, and there's a seasonality to that, and all of that. But I think you're also saying that there's a value to be placed on the tiger. Going back to dragon and tiger,
Mhm.
And I think maybe I was suggesting that organizations have become um, too dragony, at least in the office part of the organization. In the factory part, probably not.
Right.
But the office part of the organization, almost by definition, is too dragony. What does that do to people, or how might people think about bringing more tiger into the office part of the organization, not just working in the factory?
Right. Well, the way I think we've probably talked about this before, coming at it from a craftsman standpoint, I the way I think about it is whether I'm talking about making a gold ring or building a house. There's always the parts that are kind of the more fun and the parts that are kind of the less fun. There's the parts that, maybe some machines are a bit scary, or maybe you're up in a difficult position in a dangerous, and then there's other things where it's relatively smooth and easy. And, so a whole job will have parts that we might have different feelings about. And I've always kind of felt that, and this kind of relates to this idea that I think we talked about last time, and that is of for my own philosophical process, I want to have a, a a relevant human experience. In other words, I want to experience it in a way that I have the most holistic exposure to it, so that I can run my hermeneutical process on it with the least chance of misunderstanding. And so that means that I have to sort of separate, like, I can't just lick all the frosting off the cake. I've gotta take the frosting with the cake in the percentage that the cake is presented in. Same thing in life. I can't just choose the good parts and ignore the negative parts. And I think that's a lot of our mentality says, that we can actually avoid any of the uncomfortable things. But in actuality, this is, I think I've mentioned before, this concept within Kung Fu of eating bitter is related to medicinal herbs. Sometimes to attain balance, we need to eat bitter. We need to do some things that are not, we need to dig the footers as well as do the finish carpentry, or the polishing. It might be, it's fun when it gets shiny, but we also have to do the dipping it in acid and the dealing with torches and the, whatever the metaphor. And so often what I've seen in companies is, uh you'll see a founder of the company who did the whole job. So they understand it because they actually had to build their way through it. But then it seems like a conventional mentality gets in, and you have some people that are really good at just licking all the frosting off, and some people that always end up having to deal with the cake without any frosting on it. Right? Maybe the cake metaphor breaks down there. But and unfortunately, usually it's the guy who's at the bottom who's doing the thing that's not that fun, that's least compensated for it. And so there becomes a that polarization, or that what we value and what we dislike, that sort of can translate into the whole organization, and it becomes a first class, second class, third class citizen kind of situation. So so my feeling has always been that you have to do the whole job to understand the whole job. When I was running the water system, I was already approaching 60 years old, but I had done a lot of time with the shovel in the hole. There were times when I told my helpers, "Okay, do that from outside the hole," but I spent a lot of time within the hole. And so this idea of a holistic experience translates to work if we explore why work. If working is just about putting food on the table, or we might say if working is something that if people, like, if you woke up tomorrow, you won the lottery, money was not gonna be an issue, would you still do what you had planned to do today? Like, is the thing that you're compelled to do only compelling because it's feeding you? Or is there this reflexive, is work another page in the book that you're trying to understand? Is the work modifying your grasp of the whole, and then the whole recontextualizing the work in a fruitful feedback? Or is it just punching the right? And so that's quite a high bar, and I don't think that the average person, because I was inspired during what you said before to say that it really depends on where someone is in the interdependence trajectory, what settings they will be fruitful in and will be fruitful for them. Uh, there were times when I was an apprentice when I needed somebody looking over my shoulder going, "What are you doing? Don't do that, for God's sakes." Or that thing's upside down. And then there's other times when I definitely did my best work just left alone to stew and to have to work through it, right? Or to maybe not even sit at the bench, but to be doing something else while the semantic model churned around the issue until it spat out the thing, and then I could just go do it, right? I'm
It's
told that
truly
Frank Lloyd Wright
satisfying. Yeah.
worked that way.
Yeah, there's a system called Working Genius that one of my clients uses, that basically, says people have, I think, passion or talent in more or less six different areas, and they range from like wonder and innovation and things like that through tenacity and galvanizing and things like that.
Mhm.
So there's a different satisfaction, and there's a different method related to gaining victories in through each of those different modes. Like, I think it's possible for one person to develop in more and more of those ways, and I think that's kind of what you're arguing.
Yeah, yeah.
um, so so can you make the connection a little clearer about the dependence, independence, interdependence continuum? Are you basically saying that the more kind of the further along somebody is along that continuum, the more they might be looking towards work life integration, mind body integration, working across tiger and dragon, like all of those things?
Yeah, yeah, and, again, coming from a very pragmatic, this is a very American way to go about this, a la John Dewey, right? Sometimes called instrumentalism or experimentalism, and his idea was, particularly talking about education, that you needed to have some hands-on, and that to start out theoretically and then go to hands-on is to have the cart before the horse. That you get some familiarity with the hands-on issue in reality, in
That was
vivo.
Steiner's deal too, right?
I think in a lot, I mean, in a lot more with Steiner,
Yeah.
yeah. Not a normal person, you know. But 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 with Dewey, there was this idea that all teaching and all learning is experiential. And so you wrestle with the thing, and then you get the theories about why we do it this way and not that way. And so that the wrestling and the being informed by the theoretical part kind of have a natural synthesis. And I think I mean, that's one of the things that different jobs bring different aspects of ourselves out. So, having run crews, there were some people that I could only have work for me under very close supervision, and their growth curve along that path to where they were gonna work unsupervised was not steep. And then there were other people due to prior experience or their habits of bringing themselves to what they're doing that could much more quickly get to that stage. So, the question, I guess, is, are you managing the work or are you managing the worker? If you're managing the work, then you're interested in the things that numbers can tell you at the end of the month. If you're managing the worker, there might be a uh, a sort of a natural, organic relationship that it was at least modeled in the apprentice disciple or apprentice master relationship, and that is that this person has experience that's relevant to me, that will actually ease my path if I can integrate things from their semantic model. If you remember from our past episodes where we talked about this idea with the or in the last episode about the hermeneutic circle, right? That I bring an idea of things and then I start getting new pieces, and I am always integrating those new pieces into the model of the whole. And I'm changing the model of the whole thereby. But also, then when I get the next new piece, I'm a little better informed to understand it more completely because I have that more filled out background. And as that process goes on, my background gets richer, and that background helps me bring meaning out of the new piece. So, the same way, a person with a lot of experience, and there's some areas that just really show this, like troubleshooting. Troubleshooting any complicated system, whether it's a motor or it's a town's water system or it's an electronic device, that's the kind of thing where a very the Greeks actually had a specific type of a name for this type of wisdom, and they called it phronesis. And phronesis is, you could think of it as knowing what to do. Like in any given situation, knowing what to do. Sometimes it gets translated as prudence.
Um, that reminds me, I've become aware that there's a skill that some people have and some people don't, that I don't think has a name, although it seems related to what you're talking about.
Mhm.
And the name I've been using is knowing where to start the story. So so if I were to ask you, you know, what's this podcast about? You could go back to the beginning of time, or you could talk about when we first met, or you could talk about when we first had a conversation about doing the podcast. Or you have to throw your mind back to some place in order to start the story in a coherent place so the rest of it makes enough sense without explaining the whole universe every
Right,
time.
right.
And is that kind of what you're talking about?
Well, that is like a sense for coherence. And I think that that's at the root of what is this consciousness of this witness, and what are one of the qualities that it seems to come with is a tendency to coherence, which is to want to take the new piece and relate it to a whole. So that impulse to a holistic experience. Um, but I think so the idea of knowing where the story starts is grasping the whole that will contextualize the nugget that I'm translating, that I'm trying to set up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Phronesis is, well, let's see, it says here, according to Al, Greek word that means practical wisdom or sound judgment, type of intelligence that involves knowing what's good and bad for people and how to act in a given situation. Aristotle distinguished it from other types of wisdom, such as episteme, which we spoke about, which is this idea of something to stand on, and Sophia, which is the wisdom that in philosophia, the Sophia of philosophy comes from that word for wisdom. But so there's a practical, hands-on, in the minute, in the fray, kind of knowing what to do. And I've said before that mastering a situation isn't about pulling it off perfectly as much as it's knowing about what to do when things go wrong. And it's that in the moment, that's the phronesis. And to me, it's always that was the capacity that kung fu was always trying to develop, was knowing what to do. And then interestingly, as that plugs into ceremonies, when it says knowing what's good and bad for people. As we've mentioned before, one of the curanderos used to say that the ceremony was an opportunity to look at your life and see what's good and see what's bad and sort those out. So that's a type of phronesis too, and maybe we're looking at times for a sort of a little phronesis enlightenment or a little phronetical aha.
Where are you seeing that?
Which the
You said we're in a time of.
Oh, no, just that often that's what we're looking for, that when
Oh,
people are stuck in life, what they're looking for is a sort of a knowing what to do and
yeah.
knowing what's good and bad for them in this moment in a very pragmatic, "How do I act?" And see, and that's I guess that's what I'm interested in, all the conversations, about ethics, because they also have those, phronetic aspects. What's the because and this details in also with our conversation about virtue, knowing what is the appropriate way to act based on the good and the bad for everyone. Um, so, um, yeah, comes from the
Yeah,
ancient
and that
Greek word which
requires.
means to think.
Yeah. I was just thinking that the relationship to virtue implies virtue requires an understanding of coherence, right? You need to grasp the whole story such as it is, whatever that means, in a way that allows you to choose what's best for everybody in the situation, at least relatively.
Right? Virtue depends on hermeneutics.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
can't
yeah,
misunderstand the situation to act wisely in it.
yeah. Virtue depends on a well-developed cognitive model.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the idea then that in an organization, there's going to be people with more and people with less, and people with very specific to one area and other people with very specific to another area. And and then there's the overlapped that everybody has about like what are we doing here? And yeah, I know. I mean, there's definitely, and that's where this idea of bridging models and the value and the relevance of discourse and the fact that many different things can get done through discourse, and it's not always clear which of those things is happening. And by that I mean to say that you can have a lot of fruitless conversations talking at a problem and not getting to it.
Hmm.
And you might have those situations where someone like a Milton Erickson or a Virginia Satir can come in and go boom and and the pistol goes back in the holster. And it seems like it was just a verbal interaction, but somehow it turned the key in the whole semantic model that changed the piece. And I've always found that sort of thing fascinating. And that's another interesting book also called Brief Therapy, which is a look at all these different therapists that seem to have these kind of ability to drop in the one little key and then everything crystallizes around it.
Yeah, I'm curious about. I mean, that sounds like a great phronetic talent, or mastery, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious about how much of that intuition they were born with, like a savant like insight, versus being in a lot of different situations and seeing a lot of different things and creating a coherent cognitive model about how human psychology works.
Yeah. Well, and I think we can learn from artists about this. And that is that you really need to know your medium. And the way that you know your medium, if you go and watch a lot of artists' work, is you get all up in it. Right? Like a lot of painters, you'll know what colors they were painting today because they're literally all up in it, right? And there's a an immediacy with the medium, like a not being afraid to use paint, not being afraid to heat up and bend a piece of metal radically. Like I've seen this in all good craftsmen, that they have an immediacy with the medium that's just taken up through man hours. And they just the answer just seems to be do it, do it, do it, do it, do it, and so what does that mean? How do you translate that if the medium is people? And if you're talking about management, and I mean, the obvious translation would be you need to learn yourself some psychology. But I would also say that the
And
important part about
get all
psychology,
up in it.
because you're all up in it, and the important part of it is that it's not static, and that's, I think, the one of the biggest things that I see that people mistake, and that is that, I remember some science fiction story where it had some way of generating a picture of a human through their life, so that at one end and they look like a big worm, right? Because at one end, they're just the fetus, and then there's the toddler, and then there's the full grown human, but it's all sort of like another dimension is taken for the dimension of time. So it looks like a big worm, you know. And what I like about that is reminds us that humans are processes as much as anything else. Consciousness is an event, a process. So you're working with people that are in a certain chapter of their story, and you owe them to not have that story just go like this, right, circling around. Like if you do that, then I mean, I don't know about work life balance, but for me, the idea is that I'm doing my life through my work, and so I have to be able to manifest through that, and that's a pretty tall order, right? I mean, because humans have a lot of different aspects, and particularly if you're someone like me, the Russians have this saying, "He rode off in all directions," right? So that's gonna be hard for one setting to fulfill all that. So that's where something like the gig economy has worked well for me, because then, I can suffer through something for a while for the creative process, and then, uh uh, move on to the next thing. And that's where psychologies are different, and it reminds me of the book by Hesse, Narcissus and Goldmund,
Mhm.
and where you have the two different psychologies, and one is the artistic psychology, and one is more the scholar psychology. One is very steady and very regular, and one is definitely riding the roller coaster. And the creative cycle always has, even if you're a really cool, a smooth operator, so that you can handle those ups and downs on the roller coaster, that path still has ups and downs. And, I think Peterson talks about this. He's like, everybody wants to think of themselves as a creative person, but being a creative person is a type of a curse, because it's extremely hard to monetize creativity. It turns out everybody assumes the opposite, because the cases where it's successful are famously successful. But, for every one of those, for every Michael Jordan, there's how many kids shooting hoops in the parking lot just fantasizing, right? And so same with creative people. It's not necessarily easy, and it's often a way to spend a lot of time and get very little recognition or compensation, right? so so you better be getting something else out of it, right? And but so for me, there's that idea of collective enterprise, and the collective enterprise that for some people it's going to be skill building, for some people, it's gonna be a more advanced application of skills they already have. For some people, it's actually maybe at the stage of creativity and actually orchestrating all these skills of themselves and others to come up with some final whatever it is. But I think there is a phase appropriate based on people's careers and their psychology, and it's quite a mysterious thing.
Mhm.
And again, the secret to making it work is probably involved with discourse.
That's exactly where I was about to go because the cutting edge of organizational design is really about self-organizing systems and the recognition that human systems are way too complex for there to be one conductor calling all the shots and deciding
Absolutely.
how these elements are going to be coordinated.
Even a
Rather,
beehive doesn't do that, and how
these
simple is
are
their job?
horizons interacting with one another, creating new
Exactly.
quantum fields, or I don't remember exactly what the metaphor was,
Yeah,
but
and
uh,
generating new horizons,
yeah,
literally.
right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think that is it, and I think that one of my major realizations over the years has been that try as our leaders might, and I put the leaders in air quotes there, uh, you can't externally organize a self-organizing system. You can have periods where certain things will work certain ways because of, logistical realities and happenstance here and there, but a self-organizing system is going to self-organize, hence the name. And so efforts at steering human evolution are it just reminds me of the Lao Tzu where he says, "I see those who would take the world and make of it what they will, and I see that they will not succeed." And I assume that that's what he's seeing is the nature of these self-organizing systems, which, as we said before, they move in and out of these states of criticality like the clown on the unicycle. And, it isn't by the stability how do I say it? The health of the system is based on its ability to fluctuate, not on its inability to fluctuate. And this
Not on its stability, not on its continual stability, rather its ability to fluctuate between stability and instability.
it's dynamic equilibrium
Yeah,
rather
yeah,
than a static equilibrium.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think that that's the model for organizations. How could it be anything else?
That's really valuable for leaders to keep in mind, as because there is this, and it's funny that connects back to how I was asking about mind body connection too, because there is an implied stability in the answer I was looking for, as opposed to there being this fluctuation, and that is really more the answer.
I think.
Yeah.
Which is the idea of systems. The idea of system and the idea of static are really kind of opposites. And in the human mind, we kind of don't understand that intuitively. We think, "I'm gonna set up a system, and the system's gonna be good because it's gonna run very stably, and then it's not gonna surprise us because 'cause we're gonna be on our quest for certainty." It's like, "No, no, 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 no." If that was the case,
Once we
we
achieve it, we'll have no more hard stuff to do. We're just gonna
yeah,
succeed. Yeah.
and that's like, if all, aeronautical or not aeronautical, if all, uh, what's the word for a boat designer? Uh, if
Marine?
all if all marine designers thought that way, they would only design barges, right? And really what we want is something more like a Viking ship. I saw that where they dug up this huge Viking ship, and they were saying how this ship would actually flex as it went through the waves, the way that it rode the waves with a certain flexibility inside of it. It reminds me of one of these old Chinese buildings that has all the strange stuff going on up at the pillars to I don't even remember what the word would be, but they're like corbels, But if you look at them, there'll be like a many of them all over the Forbidden City, right? Well, they built a model of one of these and they subjected it to an earthquake simulator, and they showed how this structure rode up to a 9 category 9 earthquake, right? And Richter scale. And so, which is insane. I mean, anything could stand with that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just unbelievable. But that's the secret to why a lot of these old buildings in earthquake areas were still intact. So there's some intelligence in the structure that it isn't about overcoming or fighting the forces of opposition, but it's sort of riding those waves. Famous Taoist story. The army is going along a river and they see a guy on the other side, and he clearly wants to cross the river, but it's a raging rapid. And to their surprise, he just leaps in the river. And they're like, "Oh my God, we better go downstream and fish his body out." And so they head downstream a while and they get a little ways downstream and they see him and he's on their side now and he's squeezing the water out of his beard. And they're like, "Oh my God, what are you doing? We thought you were dead for sure." And he says, "Dead? That's the way I've always crossed the river." He's an old Taoist, right? And the idea was he had to yield completely to the river to be able to find his way through that turbulence to come out on the other side.
Yeah.
For an organization to do that is maybe not the way we intuitively want to think about
That's right.
organizations.
That's right. Yeah, we should definitely spend more time talking about systems and organizations. Let's put a pin in that.
Uh-huh.
Cool. Well, thank you, Brian. That was a fun little detour.
Sounds good. And we will see you next time. I guess we have coming up soon our next conversation with Dr. Claudia Hauer.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking forward to that.
So that will drop right after this one.
Cool. Thanks, Brian.
See you next time. Ciao.